and it is a great honor and privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Jennifer Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, Terry. It's quite generous of an introduction. Thank you so much. Um, Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And I really wish that I could be there in person. I'm disappointed that I can't, but I'm there in spirit, and I'm basically going to give you all of my spirit, even holding up my buffalo pen. Where did I have my buffalo pen? My buffalo pen, even though I can't be there in person. Um, but I'm doing this from my hotel in Seattle. And I want to talk a little bit or provide a little bit of a historic context because we heard a lot of good stuff already today. And I really want to add in some historic context, particularly on the story of Black Buffalo, and share history on the development and movement of that population as related to their residency on the East Side and how they were affected by environmental racism. But before I get into that, I really want to define environmental racism. And I think the best way to do that is to show the derivation of this term. This is a photo from a 1982 protest in North Carolina. And this was an article that was published in 2021 in the Washington Post. And basically what it shows is that there were protesters because North Carolina had decided to dump over 40,000 cubic yards of soil that was contaminated with cancer-causing chemicals on the land of these poor Black farming communities. And Ben Chavez, he was the one who led this protest. He's a civil rights leader, activist, also former executive director of the NAACP. And so he led this. And during this protest, many of the protesters actually got arrested. And so he wanted to go to the jail to bail them out. And on his way to the jail, he was actually pulled over by a state trooper for driving too slow. And he was actually then subsequently arrested and thrown in jail. And when he was thrown in jail, he stated, "This is racism. This is environmental racism." And while ostensibly the term environmental racism really pulls or directly points to the act of putting cancer-causing chemicals laced soil on the land of this poor Black farming community. But it really means so much more. It means really driving as a Black man and getting stopped for driving while Black in North Carolina. And so I wanted to show that example because environmental racism encompasses so many things. And so Robert Bullard, he later then defined more explicitly environmental racism. Dr. Robert Bullard is what we call the father of environmental justice. And so he defined this as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects, disadvantages, intended or unintended individuals, groups, or communities based on race or color. And so as a way to tell part of Black Buffalo story, especially in regard to Kensington Expressway, I think it'd be helpful to look briefly at the stories of our sister cities. Hopefully you were able to see the video that shows a little bit of that history. But in essence, it's kind of a tale of three cities where we have these highways, and these highways kind of did the same thing in terms of how they bifurcated and isolated Black communities in Syracuse, Rochester, and also in Buffalo. And then if we include Niagara Falls, it had a different kind of a nuance to it, but in essence, we saw how the highway was put into that area as well. And so the introduction of these highways, whether it was the 81 or the Loop in Rochester, it really went through the center of these urban or red line communities, which I'll talk about momentarily, and in populations that were often predominantly Black. They therefore displaced residents. They subjected them to air pollution as a result of the tailpipe emissions from those highways. Buildings were destroyed. I mean, there was a lot of devastation as a result of these highways. But as many have already stated, these cities have either started to decommission these highways, or have already committed to the fact that they are going to decommission either all or a portion of these highways. And so this next part is kind of getting into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of Black Buffalo. I keep saying Black Buffalo because so much of the essence of the story is related to the Black inhabitants or Black residents of Buffalo. And in order for me to really kind of get into this kind of nuts and bolts of this specific population, I like to really start from a historic context at the very, very beginning. And when I say the very beginning, I like to really just start off with this slide because it really sets the framework for the genesis of this country. And then subsequently, the type of migration patterns of people and communities throughout cities, throughout the country, and just many other aspects of how people moved. And so when we see this, we see that, if we look from approximately 1619 as the start of American enslavement all the way to the 13th Amendment, that's approximately 250 years of enslavement. And you add on another 100 years of Jim Crow era. As a result of all that, there was this systematic impoverishment, disenfranchisement, and marginalization among Black Americans. And this was perpetuated through many different aspects, whether it was the sharecropping system or Black codes or even convict leasing. All of this operated also under this Jim Crow terror of white supremacy and was maintained not only by groups like Ku Klux Klan, but also maintained by state and federal governments. And so as a result of many of these really poor social and economic conditions, Black Americans fled the South. And they started this shortly after the Reconstruction period. And so during this period of what is called the Great Migration, which occurred in two different phases, the first and the second, you saw that there were over 6 million African Americans that left the South to what was better opportunities. And one of those better opportunities was in Buffalo. And even though Buffalo was a site where some Black inhabitants started to stay during the pre-enslavement period because of its proximity to Canada, shortly afterwards, we saw that there was a significant increase of the percentage of African Americans by 145%. And then during those two waves of the migration, we see that there was almost a 200% increase. And then during the second wave, a doubling of the population. So in total, from 1940 to 1970, there was over 400% increase of the Black American population in Buffalo. But during this time, there was a decline of 50% of the white population. And no, the white inhabitants did not leave the Buffalo, Niagara area, but what happened was they left the city center and went to suburbs. And so this gets me to this next section where I talk about segregation by design, because I want to emphasize that Buffalo was not always so residentially segregated. Between like 1900, 1940, most of the city's population lived downtown because this was during Buffalo's industrial age. You wanted to live close to your workplace. And so many of Buffalo's industrial working class, which was not only Black Americans, had Polish, Italian, German, Russian immigrants, they all lived often in the same boarding house, on the industrial waterfront. But over time, the city became more segregated. And as you can see from this 2010 census block, you can clearly see the sharp demarcation of Main Street, where we have the west side and the east side, and the segregation between Black and white and other groups within the city. And so how did this come about, or how did this get catalyzed, I should say? Well, during the second wave of that Great Migration that I spoke about, we had the development of suburbs. This greatly accelerated. And this greatly accelerated due to transportation, housing production, landscape preference, social and demographic trends, many different aspects. But as such, we saw this racial residential segregation, and it has this historic roots where we see first the Great Migration. So you had over 6 million Black folks coming from the South, coming up north. And then number two, the relocation of white folks from central cities to suburban rings. Also, this residential segregation was systematically sanctioned and sponsored by federal, state, and local governments throughout the United States. And this was done through several policies and practices. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to highlight a few. And so I want to highlight a few because I want to say that Buffalo segregation was really no accident. This was the result of decades of policies that actually ultimately benefited white homeowners. So first, redlining. Now, redlining actually was a governmentally sponsored appraisal system that occurred or started in the 1930s. And this appraisal system basically rated mortgage risk. This was really to kind of see which areas had the highest mortgage risk. And so, in essence, anywhere that Black folks, anyone of color, or even foreign-born white folks, anywhere they lived was coded red and high risk. And you can see that from this HOLC Buffalo map from 1937. And so what we can see is that the best area are green and the most risky area are red. And so if we look at a few different areas, for example, this area that shows that it's redlined, it is redlined because there are 95% foreign-born folks, specifically Italian, 5% Negro, but most importantly, this area is getting more at risk because there is an infiltration of Negroes. Look at the next level. Here, there's no Negroes, but there's still 50% foreign-born, specifically German and Polish immigrants. And this area is still considered declining because there is an infiltration of more of these foreign-born white folks. And then when you get a little bit more favorable, a little bit more desirable on the spectrum, we have the blue area. Again, there's no Negroes, and at this time, only 5% foreign-born. But there is no infiltration of these quote-unquote undesirable folks. And finally, the best area, and as you know, this is right along the Delaware Park. There's no Negroes, there's no foreign-born, and most importantly, there's no infiltration. And so this color coding system solidified this practice of racially segregated neighborhoods because the value of your home was tied to whether it was in a neighborhood with folks of color. And so if we think about those areas on the map that were plagued with infiltration or foreign-born or Negro folks who were coming in, this was going to incense some kind of desperation in the sense that I need to leave this area. And so we started to see white flight. And so this brings us to this whole idea of white flight, and specifically also how the GI Bill catalyzed this flight and suburbanization. And so when we think about suburbanization, we can go back to how suburbanization proliferated in this country at the end of World War II. First, the war ended, the US economy was greatly stimulated, and this increased the money in our household bank accounts. The soldiers and servicemen came home, started families, they got married, and they started to have larger families. This is still the greatest generation in history. And so these soldiers also had GI Bills for getting homes, getting some training, but most specifically for getting homes. However, the Black servicemen were discriminated against from getting loans necessary to move to the suburbs. And so ultimately, fewer mortgages were granted to Black Americans under the GI Bill. And this allowed suburbs to become these all-white enclaves. And so in addition to this, like I said, we had actually more disposable income. And so there was more consumerism, whether it was for TVs or toasters, but most importantly, for cars, because we needed cars to get from our suburban home to now the city center. And so you had this whole automania that was occurring during this period. You know, compared to the 1940s, where only like maybe 60% of Americans own cars. Now in the 1960s, about 80%. And more importantly, a lot of folks became two-car households. So going back to this, even if Black folks or folks of color could use the GI Bill, or let's just even say, hypothetically, they had their own money, they didn't need a mortgage. Let's say they had their own money to move to the suburbs. We still could not go out to the suburbs because of racially restrictive covenants. Now, these are contractual agreements that prohibit the purchase, the lease, the occupation of a piece of property by a particular group, usually, often African Americans. And so these were clauses that were actually inserted right into the property deeds. And so when we look at an example of one, this is one from Cheektowaga at 25 Irving Place. You had Floyd and Edith Ross who were purchasing this home. And basically, this racially restrictive covenant said the property shall be occupied by members of the Caucasian race only. And so as a result, these covenants, they remained it with the property deeds from one white owner to the next. And this prohibited other folks from getting into these areas. And so as a result of some of these policies, we see that there's this significant Black-white wealth gap that we see today, because for the longest time, home ownership was a pathway to wealth, particularly for white folks who were able to gain equity and higher appraisal due to the fact that their neighborhoods were coded green or even blue. And so you see how this perpetuates from generation to generation, where today, and this is data from just 2022, it shows that white Americans in their late 50s have nearly 10 times more wealth than Black Americans. And now, going back to the whole story in terms of, okay, now we're in our suburbs and we have the cars, we have everything we ever dreamed of, but we now need more efficient ways to get back and forth. And so there had to be this chatter, so to speak, of at the federal and state levels of building these inter and intrastate highways. This, paired with urban renewal, was what ultimately destroyed Humboldt Parkway, as well as many other areas throughout the United States. And so this interstate highway project, which was funded by the 1944-1956 Federal Highway Acts, that basically just covered the cost for states. But these were coupled with urban renewal grants. And so during this time, city planners, they saw that these kind of overcrowded African-American neighbors, because remember, now we're the only ones living really in the city. Well, not the only ones, but we are predominantly in the city. And so it becomes overcrowded. Also, it's disinvested because no one's going to really disinvest in areas that were red or redlined. And so these urban renewal programs became this way to, quote unquote, redeem these urban areas. And this was actual language in DOT. They said highways were being recommended as the single greatest element to cure the city ills. And there was federal funding. So when it was time for Buffalo to decide where they were going to get this highway, because this highway was needed to make travel more efficient for white suburbanites, they said, okay, let's put it over here on the east side. And so this highway, it not only bifurcated a community, but it removed a significant source of nature. And it was stated that, this highway would help with the traffic, the overcrowding of streets as a result of the growth of the city. It promised so many aspects. And so there was much support for folks who said we needed this at the time. And so in order, for the Kensington Expressway to be built, you had to destroy the parkway. And this was a 25-year destruction process. As you can see, or we've heard earlier from some of the photos, I have similar photos that shows this complete excavation of Humboldt Parkway. And again, it not only, like I said, it bifurcated the community, but it disconnected the community from the two connecting parts. And overall, it really removed a significant piece of green space. And this kind of gets to the whole ideal of health and equities. And when I talk about health, I'm going to talk about specifically a nature inequity. But before I get to that, I want to show you just this slide because it shows all of the benefits of nature, how you can reduce blood glucose, blood pressure. It just goes on and on. There's physical and mental benefits to living near nature or being exposed to nature on a constant basis. So I like to say trees are not just something that are nice to have. They are something that we really need for our health. And so when we have these two maps, they're identical maps, but I just want to put them next to each other so you can see at the same time two different census areas for a tree or a nature equity score that looks at the tree equity or inequities of the canopy. And so you can see here at this census block on the west side, it's a 99 versus this one is a 67. The one on the west side, they basically achieve their canopy cover, where on the east side, they are at a deficit of about 25%. But what's key is it's not just a matter of a lack of trees that says, oh, the east side is a high priority or the highest priority. It's a matter of who also lives. So when you go to this website called Tree Equity Score, it creates this calculation based on other kind of indicators. So the fact that on the east side, you'd have 100% people of color, 20% unemployment, and a 75% poverty rate. Whereas on the west side, you don't have that. So it's not even a matter of like, oh, they have enough trees, but also because of the demographics of that area, it doesn't have to be prioritized. And it's not just Buffalo, but we see more and more that when you have these nature-deprived environments and communities, then you have other health disparities and health outcomes. And so one of those is heat. And so again, you see that there's basically a difference on some of the hot summer days where the east side can get up to almost 15 degrees hotter in comparison to the west side. And just looking at these two census, it's only 8 degrees, but I say only 8 degrees because on a hot day, 8 degrees can feel like an enormous burden. Speaking of burden, now we're talking about the health burdens. So this shows that even if you look at on the west side, it's light blue, and on the east side, it's dark blue. And you see that there's an almost threefold difference in the burden of poor mental and physical health outcomes. And these are reported health outcomes. And so I'm not saying that these poor health outcomes, mental and physical, are all attributed to nature equity. But what I want to say is that when you have a situation such as a nature inequity that is a poor social determinant of health, you often have a stacking of poor social determinants of health. So those are areas that also are a fruit desert, a food desert, a transit desert, lack of access to primary care doctors. Many different poor social determinants of health often stack on top of each other. And so in an aggregate as well as a cumulative way, they all attribute to these poor health outcomes. One of which is asthma. So you saw this early, so I don't have to spend much time on it, but you see that there's 95 to 100% percentile of asthma rates on the east side. And this is compared to the whole United States. Also, life expectancy. There's a 90 to 100% low life expectancy of East Side residents in comparison to the entire United States. And so for this last part, I just want to talk about that how the tunnel was built, it will just basically perpetuate environmental racism as well as poor health outcomes. And as a reminder, I say that environmental racism is any practice, like the building of the tunnel, that disadvantages or harms a group based on race or color. And we can see that here, this is a cross-sectional picture of this proposed tunnel. We see that it can be all of these impacts. So the residents will be exposed to asbestos during construction. It's going to leave out the fruit belt community, as we were told earlier. It's not going to employ local workers, so it's not going to be economically favorable. It's not going to support generational wealth. And then again, it's going to perpetuate the tailpipe emissions. And so again, it's not going to connect the two different parks. And then when we think about some of the health outcomes, now these health outcomes are specifically related to PM 2.5. I'm not going to get into all the details of what one air pollutant to another, but this is just one in the plumes that you saw earlier. And we can see that all of these health outcomes are attributed to PM 2.5. Specifically, it's also attributed to premature death. And so it's important that we can lean on one of our sister cities or all of them, but specifically Rochester. And we can see how with this photo, how they were able to fill in their East Loop. And actually I was just there on Friday and I was able to drive around, and you almost can't even believe that where you're driving, there used to be a highway. But this is something that is definitely achievable for Buffalo. And I say this right here, to wrap this up and hammer this message home, I want to show you that what we have today as a result of Buffalo's environmental racism is the placement of this Kensington Expressway in our neighborhood. But we can have something so much more. And why? On the west side, they're going to have their highway removed. Why can't we also have our highway removed? Again, these are photos that you've already seen earlier, but I just want to keep hammering it. We had this beautiful parkway. These are more photos of this beautiful parkway that we had at one point. And this, again, it's half the price. This is, $1 billion for something that is not going to even be beneficial to our health or our community in any kind of way. And so I just want to end saying that, this is what we see, this beautiful green space on the west side. Why can't the east side? And also, too, it's not just for the east side. This is something for the city. This would reconnect the entire city. So it's not just a benefit for East Side residents. It's a benefit for everyone in Buffalo. Thank you. And I want to just now hand this over